Okay, I think we are full house, so we can start. I will start with introducing myself and C-junction, and then talk about the speaker. For those who don't know about C-junction, it's basically this small venue, normally it's a reading room, where you can come and read or meet other people related to Southeast Asia. And then we have events also related to Southeast Asia on all kinds of different topics. So today is about terrorist or ISIS groups in Southeast Asia. Then we will have an exhibition on southern Thailand, a panel on torture in Thailand also, and then about funding for civil society, about local philanthropy. So as you can see, it's quite varied topics, and we also have arts workshop and other kind of activities. So everything, the bad and good side of Southeast Asia. Now today I am very pleased to have an old friend, actually. We worked together, although not in the same year, with the Ford Foundation a long time ago. But she's now become a very famous expert on issues related to conflict, radicalism, as well as terrorism in Indonesia and more generally Southeast Asia. So without further introduction, Sidney Jones will be talking first, presenting on this issue, and then we will open the floor for question and answer.
Just get this. Hi everybody. Can somebody put the projector on? So, hi everybody. Thank you for coming out in such numbers. What I'm going to do tonight is basically talk about what some of the prospects are for ISIS and the remnants of ISIS in the aftermath of its collapse in the Middle East and the shift to more of a guerrilla strategy. And we've seen already autonomous cells emerging in different parts of Southeast Asia. But I think it's worth thinking about how one group connects to another and how some of these groups do or do not connect to some of the ethnic insurgencies in the region. So, okay, let me get over here where I can okay. So, when we're talking about ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and greater Syria, we're basically talking about groups in Indonesia, the Philippines, and to a much lesser extent, Malaysia. There have been people who've transited other countries in the region, but those are the big three. Mostly, as I said, the ethno-nationalist insurgencies like southern Thailand, like Aceh in the past, and like ARSA, the Rohingya movement today, don't mix with the global jihad for a variety of reasons. It's important for their own credibility to focus on nationalist goals, and often these movements have wanted support from people, especially in the West, that are deeply opposed to Islamist groups. The big exception to this is the Philippines, but even in the Philippines, when you've had ex-MILF or ex-MNLF or Abu Sayyaf join with ISIS, it's been just that, splinter groups of a broader movement. It was different during the period of the Estrada leadership in the Philippines, when there was a regional organization called Jamaah Islamiyah, which worked very closely with the special forces of the MILF. But in the recent years, the MILF, as you know, has been much more focused on its agreements with the Philippine government. So the biggest risk of violence today comes from extremist groups in these three countries, and it's not from returnees from Syria. It's overwhelmingly from people who never left home, even when they've had some kind of communication with Syria. That said, one of the big issues today is what Southeast Asian governments are going to do about their nationals who were detained in Kurdish detention camps or Kurdish-run detention camps in Syria or Iraq. As you may know, there are about 75,000 people that are estimated to be currently in one form or another of Kurdish-controlled camps or prisons, but overwhelmingly, they're not fighters. The number of foreign fighters is about 800, and the rest are overwhelmingly women and children. We also have to focus, however, on the fact that women in ISIS cells, whether we're talking about Sri Lanka or Indonesia, are becoming more prominent. Just a reminder of the background. ISIS, ISIL, and Islamic State these days all refer to the same thing. In Indonesia, we still say ISIS because it's a nicer acronym, but basically, we're talking about the same thing. Basically, it's a movement that went into Syria from Iraq in 2013 and established a new caliphate in June 2014. Those dates are important to remember because the first movement of Indonesians to Syria who eventually joined ISIS actually began even before the announcement of the caliphate in 2014. Likewise, in the Philippines, some of the most important figures from Malaysia who ended up effectively directing Marawi and the siege of Marawi joined the ISIS groups in Mindanao before it was officially ISIS. So they came in April 2014 and the caliphate was declared in June. So of the 40,000 fighters that eventually joined that territory controlled by ISIS in Syria and Iraq that was as large as the UK, the largest contingents were Russia, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, and France. Southeast Asia contributed a very small number. Indonesia sent around 800, which was lower per capita than Denmark or most of the European countries. Malaysia, at its height, had about 90. Singapore had 3. And no one knows to this day how many there were from the Philippines. There were only ever 3 Filipinos identified by name. It was probably a little more than that, but the big focus of the Philippines group was in the Philippines. It wasn't in Syria. So the other really interesting thing about the ISIS battles in Syria and the ISIS propaganda in Syria was that the reason that Southeast Asians left was all pull factors. They didn't go because of repression, injustice, poverty, other kinds of grievances, occupation, violence. They went because there was an attraction of the Islamic State. They went to join the caliphate. They went to bring up their children in a pure Islamic state, so the propaganda directed at families, and the number of family units that joined was huge. There were all of these apocalyptic prophecies about the Imam Mahdi or the Islamic savior returning at the end of time to Sham, to Greater Syria. And Indonesians and Malaysians, like many Muslims from other parts of the world, were very much drawn by these prophecies because they wanted to be there at Judgment Day. They wanted to be there when Islam was finally victorious. And that meant when they left, they had no intention of coming back. So this was very unlike the people who went to Afghanistan in the late 80s and early 90s. First of all, because all those people were men. And secondly, because those people went to get training and skills to come back and fight repressive governments at home. The Indonesians in Afghanistan went to get skills to fight the Suharto regime, and so on. The interesting thing is that while the overwhelming majority of Indonesians and Malaysians went to ISIS, the Malaysians also were involved in a non-ISIS militia, and there was a small group of Indonesians who went to the Al-Qaeda affiliate, which was known as An-Nusra. Now, Jamaat Islamiyah was the group that had sent many people to Afghanistan, and when they sent people to Al-Nusra, it was in the same mode that they had sent people to Afghanistan. So the people who went to the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria went as single men, not families, and also went for short periods of time. Why that's interesting is because just last week, the Indonesian government, for the first time in a long time, arrested two very senior Jamaat Islamiyah leaders who it is believed were running the operation that sent people for training to Syria. So we're going to get, for the first time in a long time, I think we're going to get some interesting information about Jamaat Islamiyah's current state. But there were other issues as well. But the important point is it was a pull factor, not a push factor. From the beginning, as I mentioned, the biggest risk was from people who stayed at home. But most of the cells that developed into pro-ISIS units had some contact with people who were already in Syria. And initially that took place on Facebook or on WhatsApp. Later, Telegram, the social media app, became the application of choice, partly because it was encrypted and partly because there were different gradations of how you could participate in Telegram, from fairly open public chats to very private chats that even the administrators of Telegram had no way of getting into. So that kind of contact became critical. This now iconic photo comes from a June 2016 ISIS propaganda video, and that's the first time when we begin to see ISIS Central urge people, if you can't go to Syria, go to the Philippines. And it was clear that conflict in Syria was making it much harder to get in from Turkey. Lots of people were getting caught in Turkey and deported. And if you were in ISIS, it was much harder to get out. So if you can't get to Syria, join the Philippines. This was also interesting because the three people who appeared in that video were an Indonesian here named Abu Walid, who later became one of the chief architects of Marawi, a Filipino named Reza Kiram, who was one of the three Filipinos who was ever identified by name. He's now in a Kurdish detention center. And it's one of the really interesting things is what the Philippines government is going to do about that. And then Rafi Uddin, a Malaysian that we believe is killed. Abu Walid was killed in January of this year. So three different people from Southeast Asia all urging that their compatriots go to the Philippines to fight. And we then had the culmination with the takeover of Marawi basically from May to October 2017. And one of the big questions now is, after so-called liberation of Marawi, what's happened to the different ISIS components that made up the coalition that took over Marawi? And we'll come back to that later. But basically, we've seen a series of attacks carried out in Southeast Asia in the name of ISIS, and which are claimed by ISIS on its media. We had the January 2016 attack in Jakarta. We had this exhortation to go to the Philippines. We had Marawi. And then we had several more recent attacks that have attracted a lot of attention. The problem is, every time a new attack takes place, it shifts the focus of analysts in terms of wondering what the next big problem is going to be. So after May 2018, when we had 3 families with little kids undertake suicide bombings where mothers strapped explosive belts to their 9-year-old daughter and other kids, the question was, are we going to see more women and children involved in bombings? In a way, this was a one-off, but the fact is we have seen more women, not families. We haven't seen whole families, but we've now had 2 incidents in Asia where women detonated themselves and their kids rather than surrender to the police. One was in Sibolga, North Sumatra, in March, and one was in Sri Lanka in April. So that idea that you detonate yourself rather than and your children can be sacrificed has now become part of the legend. Although, come to think of it, I just read that in Sri Lanka it actually may have been the woman's husband who detonated the bomb that killed her and the children. In this case, though, it's very interesting why these 3 families decided to detonate themselves. It turned out that they believed in this prophecy that the end of the world was coming. The bombing took place in May. They believed the world was going to end in October, and it would be enveloped by this black cloud where it would become impossible to breathe. And they knew they would die, but they wanted to be sure that they got into heaven. And there was no guarantee, but if they undertook a suicide bombing and became martyrs, then they would have that assurance that the entire family would go to heaven, and that became the motivation here. In July 2018, we had the first ever suicide bombing in the Philippines. The Philippine government insisted that you couldn't have a suicide bombing in the Philippines because Filipinos were culturally immune from suicide bombings. But what's interesting, the bomber was a dual nationality German-Moroccan who had come from a town in Germany where 2 other Germans had actually also tried to get to the Philippines, but had been stopped en route. But when he decided to be the driver of the van, there were actually 2 other volunteers. One was an Indonesian and one was a Filipino. And that Filipino is now in custody. So the idea that suicide bombings are impossible culturally in the Philippines is as untrue as what the Indian government says, which is that Indian suicide bombings are culturally impossible. Then we had the January 2019 bombing of Holo Cathedral, where the Philippines government claimed that the perpetrators who actually planted the bombs were an Indonesian couple, a man and wife. There was no forensic evidence, in part because the crime scene had been totally contaminated, among other things, by President Duterte trampling all over it with a whole media delegation in the day after that the bombing. But there actually is enough anecdotal evidence to suggest that maybe it's true that Indonesians were involved, but a lot more work has to be done before it can be accepted as fact. If it's true, the question is, where did they come from and what group did they belong to? Very unclear at this stage. But as each one of these incidents took place, the focus shifted from, are we going to have more women and children, Is the Philippines going to be a safe haven for foreign fighters? And are we going to see more cross-border cooperation between Indonesians and Filipinos and God knows who in Holo? So now we have an even bigger shift in focus. As you know, last week there were riots in Jakarta on May 22nd. And one of the issues which has come up is there any possibility that political polarization in Indonesia following the election could lead to more overlap between hardline political Islamist activists and terrorists? Now, traditionally, those groups have been almost totally separate. A little overlap, a few cases, but like 5 or 6. Very rare that you have somebody from a politically activist, conservative Islamist group cross over into violent extremism. They don't recruit from the same pools. They don't have the same ideology. They don't like each other. They trash each other. In some cases, they've even had physical clashes. But one of the things that we have seen since the riots is more conversations on the open social media networks that are pro-ISIS from people who were sympathetic to the political activists. So the question is, can anger over the election and subsequent developments push more people into extremist violence in Indonesia? We have one precedent for this in Solo, in Central Java, and it was a group that did go over wholesale into what became a pro-ISIS group. But that's one of the things to watch. We don't have answers yet, but it's a question mark. In the Philippines, the big question is, will the Bangsamoro autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, which is the new autonomous region that basically came into force in February, be able to succeed in dampening grievances and a long history of neglect by the Philippines government in Mindanao? But the challenges of BARMM are in a way overwhelming because they have to give a meaningful role to at least 12,000 and maybe 30,000 fighters who are going to be demobilized. They have to try as much as possible to keep this new government clean, and that's going to be a real uphill battle. And they have to break the existing power of clans in the Philippines who are Moros themselves, they're Muslim themselves, but they see BARMM as a real threat to their power and are determined to try and keep it weak. So for all of these reasons, if BARMM does not succeed, the worry is that there are people in Mindanao who will see an Islamic State as a possible alternative. That's the legacy of ISIS in the Philippines, that it has planted the idea that an Islamic State is an answer to corrupt democracy. And one of the things the Philippine authorities never understood was that this was an attractive ideology to well-to-do, comfortably off, university-educated students as much as it was to the foot soldiers of splinter groups of existing insurgencies. So keeping an eye on what happens in the Philippines is also very important. There's another issue in the Philippines, which was that when Marawi was taken over, it was basically the ethnic Maranaos who were who composed the MILF in the area, and the lead group that took over Marawi was also ethnic Maranao. Many of those people in Marawi were resentful that the MILF, which had arms and fighters, didn't come to their aid, either against the extremists who took over Marawi or against the government forces when they started coming into the city. So the credibility of the MILF declined substantially in the ethnic Maranao area, leaving the MILF as a largely one ethnicity group, which is Maguindanao. That gets complicated in terms of the ethnic groups in the Philippines, but it's one factor there. In Malaysia, the question is there a possibility, actually there are a lot of questions in Malaysia. There are three that are important. One is there a question of more collaboration with ISIS cells in Indonesia? And we just had an example in Malaysia of the special branch arresting one Indonesian and two Malaysians who they said were involved in a plot to attack churches and Hindu temples, both in Malaysia and in Indonesia. The reason that we would pay any attention to this at all is that it drew the notice of ISIS media and was posted on its weekly bulletin last week. That's very unusual unless the people involved really did have some ISIS connection. So the question is, are we going to see more cross-border cooperation? Also, if you look at the number of arrests that have taken place in Indonesia, there are a lot that have been in Sumatra. So we've seen a number of cells emerge in places where there wasn't a lot of extremist activity in the past. Riau, Jambi, South Sumatra. Also, increasing amount of activity in North Sumatra and in West Sumatra, which is also traditionally almost immune from terrorist activity. The more activity you have in Sumatra, especially along the coastal areas of Riau, Jambi, and South Sumatra, the greater the likelihood there's going to be some kind of cross-border cooperation with Malaysia. Also, in Aceh, a few cells have emerged, and there's a big Achenese community in Malaysia. So just one thing to think about. Another issue in Malaysia is Sabah, because if you look at the map, then you can see that if you're transiting from Indonesia to Mindanao, one of the traditional routes is to go up the coast of East Kalimantan into Sabah, and then either go from Tawau, which is here, across the islands of Tawi-Tawi, Basilan, and then up into Zamboanga, or you take the ferry that leaves from Sandakan here and go directly to Zamboanga. So there was a lot of interest in having trilateral patrols that could somehow interdict terrorism. The problem was twofold. One was that the activity in terms of maritime issues was very close to the coast. And it's actually a problem that is better served by coast guards than it is by any kind of open patrols in this area. The other thing is that of the 34 Indonesians, or 34 and 35, who tried to go to Marawi at the height of the siege, some were arrested before they could leave, some were arrested in Malaysia, some got deported, some got killed once they got to the Philippines. But most of them went by air. They went by Cebu Pacific into Manila Airport and got a domestic flight from there. They didn't go by sea. So it's an interesting solution, having a trilateral maritime patrol as a solution to terrorism, but it may not be the answer to the problem. And then there's this third issue that Malaysia has to worry about, which is possible spillover of radicalization of the Rohingya and of the Bangladeshi communities in Malaysia. Now, the name of the new insurgency that the Rohingya that grew up in Rakhine State in Myanmar and that really got started around 2012, 2013 is now known as ARSA, the Arakanese Rohingya Salvation Army, using this symbol. And it is activities by ARSA that triggered the horrific violence in August 2007, that began in August and October to October 2017. But there is no indication thus far that ARSA has any links to pro-ISIS extremists. If it does develop those because of the untenable situation in the Cox's Bazar camps, the chances are that they will look more to South Asian extremists than they would to Southeast Asian extremists. The problem is that there are 130,000 Rohingya in Malaysia. Some of those leaders were involved in the creation of ARSA, so there could be recruitment of Rohingya from Malaysia, but it wouldn't necessarily mean any kind of threat of violence on Malaysian soil. The problem is that we just also had 2 Rohingya arrested in Malaysia who were interested in an attack on the Myanmar embassy in KL. So that's one of the worries that Malaysia has. Also, there are large numbers of Bangladeshi workers and students in Malaysia, and it was students who had gone to Malaysian universities, well-to-do, well-connected, and well-off, who were involved in that bakery attack in Dhaka in 2015. So the idea that you could have radicalization of students at Malaysian universities from some countries in South Asia is also a possibility. And there was one case of 2 Bangladeshis who tried to get to Marawi, and there's some question about whether among the small number of foreign fighters in the Philippines there's anyone from Bangladesh still there. All that indicates is that even though we're talking about very small numbers of people, there is the possibility of Malaysia being the point where Southeast Asian extremism meets South Asian extremism, and it's one thing that everybody should keep an eye on. So let's go back very briefly to the idea of the concerns of foreign fighters returning from Syria. And they're often by governments called FTF, foreign terrorist fighters. The concerns are that anybody coming back from Syria would have skills, experience, legitimacy, commitment, international contacts to strengthen the capacity of local ISIS supporters. Because when you look at the kind and the quality of attacks in Indonesia in particular, also the one attack that took place in Malaysia, and some of the attacks in the Philippines, they're not very professional, they're not very well thought through, but it doesn't take very much these days to actually translate online instructions into something that can do serious damage. Another concern was that FTF from outside Southeast Asia would seek safe haven in the Philippines because of the large number of ungoverned spaces. And while the estimates of the numbers there range from a very low of 7 or 8 to a high, which is ridiculous, of over 100. I think the real number is probably about 15 or so. But even 2 or 3 could be a problem. What it means if you have any of these fighters coming back from Syria is not just that they bring capacity and prestige and leadership, it also could mean a changing of the targets that you have for some of these local groups. Overwhelmingly in Southeast Asia, it's the police and the military that have been local targets. We still have occasional Christian churches being the targets, as we saw in Holo, and periodically in Indonesia. But we haven't had attacks on foreigners in a major way in a long time, and that could change if we saw people coming back. The issue, as I mentioned, about how to deal with the ISIS detainees in Kurdish-controlled areas is becoming more and more urgent. The number of Indonesians is about 100 that we know of, but for example, in the largest largest camp in Syria, there are 38 Indonesians, but they're almost all women and children, and 15 of the children were born in the Middle East. One of the things that's happened is Indonesian women, when their husbands die, or when, women of any nationality, when their husbands die in combat in Islamist areas, they are considered not only to be the widows of martyrs, but they rise in social status. So it becomes an important tactical move for a fighter to marry the widow of a martyr. And it means that we have seen Indonesian women marrying Senegalese, Frenchmen, Chechens, and so on. What does that mean looking ahead for the possibility of alliances by marriage? It's just a problem that nobody's thought of, and maybe it won't be a problem, but it means that understanding the marriage patterns is absolutely critical. There's one prison run by the Kurds called El Maliki. It's in the town of El Maliki, where a lot of the big high-profile prisoners are detained. It includes the Filipino Reza Kiram. It includes the Indonesian Munawar Khalil, who was one of the people who arranged a lot of the financing for people to go to Syria and for people to go to Marawi. And it includes the Bangladeshi married to a Japanese who took out Japanese citizenship and was considered the mastermind of the bakery attack in Dhaka. So all these people are detained there. What are their governments going to do? Up till now, there's no good plan. I am sure that the Indonesians and Malaysians will take back their own nationals. The question is, if they do agree to take them back, how are they assessed before they go home, and what kinds of programs will be in place when they get there? The other really interesting thing is, if people went to Syria with no intention of ever coming back, will they go on to another battleground if they can get out of Syria? And one of the really interesting things is how much Khorasan, or the Afghan-Pakistan area that ISIS controls, which is tiny, but in Afghanistan and Pakistan, how much that's captured the imagination of people around the region. And we already have, when I did this slide, I said 5 Indonesians. I think it's actually 7 Indonesians who are detained now in Kabul who tried to join Khorasan. And I think they include 4, if not 5 women. So again, it was families going and not just individual men. Also, the German who was the suicide bomber in Mindanao in July 2018 wanted to go to Khorasan and eventually ended up in Mindanao. And finally, I think the question of women is continuing to be extremely important. Most of these fundamentalist movements, whether you're talking about the far right and the neo-Nazi movements, or you're talking about the hardline pro-ISIS movements, have a very traditional view of women as mostly good for reproducing lots of little mujahideen or lots of little fighters, or as teachers or as supporters of their husband, but it was the women themselves within ISIS who demanded a larger role and who continually pressed for a larger role. And that was in part a consequence of the role they had as propagandists and the encouragement that ISIS gave them to recruit and reach out to other women. And that meant a lot of networks developed on social media and discussions about the role of women more generally took place. So, in conclusion, I think we have to look at Southeast Asia in a way as a relative backwater of the global jihad. It's not the second front. It's never going to be the second front, as that's in quotes. It's what some people suggested it would be. It's not a place that's the heartland of the Middle East, of the Islamic world. It's not a place where you've got well-known ulama from radical. Nobody's reached the pantheon of radical teachers and so on. But we now have ISIS in guerrilla mode, and that means that some of these small isolated cells, even if they're acting on their own, are going to continue to be very important. No one as yet has found a good formula for countering violent extremism, or at least countering extremist teachings or radicalization, although there are some interesting local initiatives that take place. Generally, when it works, it's a local initiative and not something that's done nationwide. But also, regional cooperation still remains extremely spotty because of the high level of distrust even among Indonesian, Malaysia, and the Philippines. So, given the fact that the political dynamics in each of these countries is constantly shifting, and given the fact that ISIS has shifted to this guerrilla strategy now, we're going to be watching this problem for a long time to come. Thank you. So, yeah.
We are going to open the floor. I think there are some seats in the front because some Indonesians are opening the plastic in the back. So if you want to sit, please move to the front. Okay, first three questions or comments or inputs. One. Any other? We have a lot to digest. Okay, let's start.
I'm interested, especially in Rakhine and Bangladesh conflicts are working situated in a couple of years. And as you've obviously heard, there's lots of discussion about the radicalisation of the Rohingya, especially now they've gone over into Bangladesh. And it seemed like they were perfect fodder for radicalisation. And all the ingredients, I'll go into it a bit better than me. And also there's talk now that around the camps, you have got people who say they're ARSA, and there's talks of ARSA having the links with ISIS. And we're not sure, it could just be opportunist thugs getting some sort of acceptance or some credibility by linking themselves to ARSA. But also, in connection with ISIS as well, we know that in northern Rakhine, you did have some imams that did have training in Wahhabism, so you have got that connection as well. Are you able to unpack that in some way, get some clarity on it?
I'm gonna give you a short answer, and then I'm gonna ask Fiona if you want to add anything. Okay, basically, there's definitely a presence of Salafi preachers in the camps. And we know that in addition, even just from the Indonesian humanitarian organizations that have gone there are the government-approved ones who've gone in, but then there are also some fairly hard-line Salafist groups who don't have government approval of any kind, but who have gotten into the camps and who announce it on their websites and have pictures of them distributing Qurans or reading with groups there. So I don't have any doubt that there is some Salafi preaching going on. I haven't seen, as I mentioned, anything that would suggest links to ISIS. Now, if there were, it's unlikely to come through ISIS Indonesia or ISIS Malaysia, I think, but more likely to come through Pakistani extremist groups. And the only reason I say that is not because of evidence now, but it's because of the fact that there was apparently some training in the very beginning when ARSA was formed by the LET in Pakistan. And for what reason, how that came about, I don't know. But I would think that the link would go through Pakistan and South Asia more than it would go through Southeast Asia. But I don't have any evidence that it exists.
Yeah, that would make some sense because Ali Ullah, of course, the leader of ARSA, connected to Pakistan as well as Saudi.
Yeah, so it was the diaspora in Karachi and Saudi that basically got ARSA started, although there was participation of at least one or two Rohingya in Malaysia as well. But it was overwhelmingly funded and dreamed up by the diaspora in the Middle East and South Asia.
I also wonder in that time, because I know a lot of funding is coming in from the Saudis, for example.
Yeah, so I don't know how the funding works on this kind of thing, because in Indonesia, funding from the Saudis generally did not get translated into funding for violent extremism. So you can't assume automatically that if you have Saudi funding of teachers and mosques, that you therefore get money diverted into extremist movements as well, but there may be indirect links along the way.
Yeah, there's the connection.
Yeah, and I'll tell you one really interesting way of funding that. One of the issues is a lot of Saudi private donors, not the government, end up funding some of these groups, and that private money can go anywhere. And one of the ways that it gets into Indonesia and around all of the anti-money laundering stuff and all of the vigilance on tracking transfers is that there are these travel agencies for helping people go on the pilgrimage and go for the Hajj and Umrah, which is the little Hajj. And what happens is that a group of 30 or so, 20 or 30 pilgrims will go on one of these tours to Saudi Arabia, and then when they're ready to come back, somebody who works with the travel agency will give each one of them just under the legal limit of cash to come back in. So nobody's committing a crime. Every person has just under $10,000 that they can bring in, and then there's somebody at the other end who collects it.
Okay, do you want to add anything?
I think you, I'm sorry, yeah, I'm Fiona McGregor. I'm a journalist. I was working in Myanmar for 4.5 years, and I've been based in Cox's Bazar for the last year and a half, but I've just moved to Bangkok now. I think what you said really was really important in terms of the image and the ways, the idea of I think it's certainly true in camps in Cox's Bazar that you're seeing a more hard-like form of religion, that's coming through from education, the fact that there isn't a formal education system, particularly for older students, as we left a big gap that is filled by hardline ideas to address it, but that's not the same as ISIS, like violent extremism. And yes, also our ARSA operating in the campsite, I think that's pretty well understood, and that they are there's certainly a fear of the group.
There's a debate about to what extent the people call themselves ARSA to legitimise their exploitation.
And yeah, I mean, think it seems pretty clear that there is recognized groups that represent ourselves. But also, I think what you said about the diaspora and their influence on this, I think it's very difficult with what's happening in the camps and what we're seeing coming from Malaysia or other parts of the world. And these guys are running the ARSA Twitter account, so they're very aware of their social media, and they're not really.
No, it's fun. They changed their name from Harekat al-Yaqin to the Salvation Army.
Yeah.
So it would be better understood by some of their readers abroad.
So it's hard to see.
But they've also gone pretty quiet recently.
Yeah.
And a few attacks that came out back in the day that's been blamed on us, and they were pretty amateurish, and probably not the AA doing them with their fellow fiction. But they're no one claiming their responsibility, which is unusual. I wasn't sure about that. But there's
Okay,
another thing coming up.
let's open the floor for other questions and other ideas.
To keep on Bangladesh.
Wait, okay, 1, 2, in the back. Is the third one? 3. Okay, so please.
I'm just like
Loud voice.
I think there's a fundamental difference, at least so far, in the way that ARSA is acting, in that I can't visibly see any specific terrorism that they are creating, and their high visibility on social media makes me think that they are trying to define their own legitimacy and say that they are following the Geneva Convention and whatever, in their own way. It may not be true, but they are making that classic sense of legitimacy. The second point I'm very curious about, I was in Cox's and in Dhaka in March, and every day in the local newspapers, the Bangladeshi press, there were stories of young Rohingyas being arrested off of the domestic flights carrying methamphetamines. And of course, the AA, the Arakan army, is associated with meth production, and then moving and selling it in Dhaka and Bangladesh. I'm wondering if there are any links either to terrorism or to ARSA itself.
Okay, in the back. Yes.
I have 2 questions. I need a pen to write some of these down. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, please.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One is about, I just want to ask your opinion. What would be the good measure to de-radicalize people? My understanding is that it has something very little to do with poverty. Like in the case of Marawi, the Maunde, brothers, actually coming from very rich family and very well educated as well. So what could be a good idea about de-radicalized people? The second question is, have you monitored the south of Thailand? And have you seen any worrying sign of support from the ISIS among the movements in the south of Thailand?
Okay, last question.
My question about Indonesia, that after election, when we know that the candidate that selling identity in political got 45% in vote, and it's also have mapping the position of radicalism in Indonesia, especially also they got 18 province winner.
You got what?
18 province.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this province also, Prof. Mahfud MD also said that this province is quite radical. And I can see that. So it's mapping the new position of the radicalism and the ISIS especially.
Okay. On ARSA and terrorism, I think it's clear that ARSA was involved in beheadings and use of terrorist tactics against informants. But terrorism is a tactic, right? It's very rarely an end in itself. But there are a lot of insurgent groups that have engaged in terrorist tactics, and ARSA is one of them. It went after insurgents, it went after people involved in the military, and it did like beheading. It has not, as far as I know, ever, well, there are accusations that it went after a village of Hindus. I don't know whether that was ever proven or not.
Not confirmed.
Yeah, okay. No, I think there's some allegations there. Now, I'd already forgotten the second part of your question.
The drug trade.
Oh, the drug trade. I only know what I've read, but there appear to be links being made between. I mean, that some of the ARSA leaders have been involved in sales or distribution of drugs in the camps, and that we were talking before this started, that the death of Nur Salam could have been linked to a drug-related trade more than to insurgent activities. So I think that's one of the things that Bangladeshis are going to have to pay a lot of attention to. It's interesting that in Indonesia, there's almost no case of narco-terrorism or of links between drug network, which is big, and the terrorist network. In the Philippines, there were allegations by the Duterte government that the Maute brothers were getting some of their funds for the operation through drug trade, but there may have been some, but I think there were lots of other sources of money for the Mautes as well. But it becomes much more of a problem when you get to southern Thailand, Myanmar, and points west. On the de-radicalization, basically the key to de-radicalization, if you're talking about pulling people out of movements that they've already joined, becomes overwhelmingly a prison project, because it's very difficult to get to groups that are still operating clandestinely. So what the government has access to are people in prison. And there, the kind of program that works best, whether you're talking about extremists from Islamist groups or you're talking about extremists from neo-Nazi groups in Eastern Europe, is a mentoring program where you've got some kind of systematic, ongoing attention. This is particularly true for young people. Over a lengthy period of time, where you can somehow get them, first of all, seeing officials as basically kind people rather than torturers or whatever, where you have some opportunity to introduce them to an alternative network, and where you can give them some kind of feeling of status. So if you have those elements, then the chances that a de-radicalization program can work becomes higher. The Singaporeans have made a lot of capital out of their religious rehabilitation program that focuses very strongly on religious counseling, but it's unlikely to be as successful in a place like Indonesia, where you basically can't use moderate Muslims to preach to extremist Muslims. You've got to have somebody that comes from the same community doing the counseling. So there has been some success in, for example, in one of the former Bali bombers, basically arguing to newly detained prisoners that violence wasn't illegitimate, but it was counterproductive. So that if you did a kind of cost and benefit analysis, it was the cost far outweighed the balances. But you're now dealing in the Philippines and in Indonesia with a lot of people that join the movement basically off the streets. They don't have the religious knowledge even to be swayed by some of these arguments. So it's a generation that's actually, in some ways, I suppose it could be easier, but they've proven to be harder to try and de-radicalize than the earlier Jemaah Islamiyah period. But anyway, the key is, I think, lies in the mentoring. And that's true for the deportees as well, because we now have more than 550 deportees in Indonesia who were radical enough to sell everything they had and go to Syria, but who have now come home to nothing. Sorry, what was the other one? Southern Thailand. We don't monitor Southern Thailand, and it's partly because there were so many better groups, including Deep South Watch and others in Southern Thailand, that we didn't think we could add anything to that. And also, it was very clearly a case of an insurgency, not a jihad, in Southern Thailand.
Indonesia or the election?
Oh yeah, sorry.
13 provinces.
Yeah, so I think Indonesia today is more polarized in more ways than it's been in a long, long time. And it's polarized between Muslim and non-Muslim. It's also polarized between Java and non-Java, or Java and outside of Java. And that puts a huge extra burden on the Jokowi government on its second term to figure out how you try to reconcile these two camps. And it becomes harder to do in a way because of the vice president that Jokowi now has, who comes from the largest Muslim organization in Indonesia, Nahdlatul Ulama, but whose stronghold is largely in Java. Jokowi won this election because of Nahdlatul Ulama vote in Central and East Java. So there's resentment even among some moderate Muslim organizations outside Java that all of the benefits and rewards are going to this organization, which represents, in their view, Javanese Islam as opposed to a broader national approach. Now, Nahdlatul Ulama would be the first to argue with that. There'd be a lot of people who would argue back, but that's the perception. So I think there's people are going to be looking at who he appoints for as ministers. People are going to be looking at what kind of inclusiveness there is in terms of who he brings into the new government now. But it's a big problem.
Okay, last round of questions. Any more comments on this or different topics? Let's see if there is anyone else.
And if there isn't there, I'll tell you a great story.
Not yet, not yet. Okay, any more? No? Okay, so please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Sidney, for sharing your insights. Shifting the perspective to government response, and I'm very aware that your answer might be different for respective countries, but in light of the operational threat, risk and vulnerability, what do you think are the major flaws from the government side in terms of response or preparedness, or rephrasing it, where do you see there is room to improve the way in which governments are dealing with it?
Well, the easiest answer is the Philippines, because the Philippines has relied on a military approach largely because they were dealing with large armed groups who represented a significant security threat in Mindanao. But when you rely on airstrikes, what do? You create alienation among the civilian population that gets hit. So in Marawi, we've got ongoing resentment, not just against the extremists, but against the government, because that's where most of the destruction was caused. Also, I think of wanted terrorists, because what that does is distort the strategy for dealing with terrorism, so you're focusing on individuals because of the money.
The Mama Zapata incident, actually, interagency weapons.
Yeah, so I would say, wherever possible, keep it at a police level and don't make it a military approach. And the other problem with making it a military approach, when you're talking about regional cooperation, is that if Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia all have police as the lead agency, and the Philippines has the military as the lead agency, they don't talk to each other. And it becomes bureaucratically and institutionally a big problem. How do you overcome that in theory? You know, the Philippines put together this kind of counterterrorism council that would be able to translate across institutions. But that doesn't work unless you've got someone who can actually knock heads and force cooperation, and we don't have that in the Philippines. I'll give you one interesting example. I was interested in these Indonesians who supposedly had been the bombers in the Holo bombing. And I was in touch with one of the investigators, a Philippine investigator, police investigator, in Zamboanga. And only a couple of weeks ago, I sent him a WhatsApp saying, was there any development on the Holo case? Were they get anywhere, identifying who the Indonesians were? And he said, no, but we have a video of the lady. And I said, you've got a video of the woman who was involved in the bombing? And I said, have you shared it with the Indonesians? And he said, no. And I said, do you mind if I tell the Indonesians that you have the video? And he said, oh, please do. And I suddenly realized the bureaucracy is so Byzantine that he would have had to go through so many steps to get the approval to share the video that it wasn't worth the trouble. But now I hope the Indonesians will make it because. But so that's one example. But I think that in terms of what also doesn't work is to have big meetings in five-star hotels where you gather 200 journalists or 200 women or 200 lawyers or 200 prosecutors, and you lecture them. You might as well save the money on air tickets and on the hotel because it doesn't work. It also doesn't work. There was one thing that was tried was to take 4 or 5 leading ulama from Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia and bring them into the prisons and have them hold a discussion with some of the most ideologically hardcore prisoners there. These were all people who had changed sides and were well known to have changed sides, even to the people who were going to be brought into the discussions. And the prisoners enjoyed the discussions, enjoyed having a change in regime. No way they were going to be changing any minds as a result of these actions. So I think you have to think through all the time if you're trying to change ideological outlooks, the question is who has the legitimacy in the group to deliver that message and who has the religious credentials at the same time to do that, and how well do you understand the consumer of these messages. So if you're going to try to, for example, use counter narratives in a social media approach, you've got to understand who reads the messages that go via social media to these extremist networks and why they're so popular. You can't just send out a message about jihad having different interpretations. They're more complicated messages.
Thank you.
My question, if I may, related also to the election. How much is religious and how much is other factors?
Okay,
It's
well,
always a big either ethnic or conflict or state terrorism or whatever. There are many factors in the play, for Indonesia in particular.
Okay.
What we are seeing, right?
Yeah, so we have this polarization. We have this polarization, no question. But what's very interesting is if you look at the difference between who was involved, as far as we know, in the mobilization for the riots on the 22nd of May just now, and who was involved in what we call the 212 movement, or the movement to bring down the Jakarta governor. And many of the religious groups that were involved in the anti-Ahok campaign did not take part in the 22 May riots. So the Salafists, for example, weren't there. What we saw taking place was far more political than it was religious, but it doesn't alter the fact that many of these ordinary Indonesian voters in Sumatra, Kalimantan, and Sulawesi who voted in good faith for Prabowo because they believed that he was going to protect Islam and their interests more than Jokowi was going to do, are going to have to, their concerns are going to have to be addressed somehow. And they genuinely believe that some of the actions taken by Jokowi were anti-Islam. So it's very hard to separate politics from religion completely. That said, some of the people involved in the riots on the 22nd of May were not involved in the 212 movement, and some of the people who were involved in the 212 movement stayed away precisely because it smelled too political.
So, any more question? Otherwise, we listen to the story and then we close the...
Okay, I'll just tell you, this is just this fascinating example of how all these groups around the region are connected. So I was telling Leah this earlier. Basically, this involves an Indonesian in 2016 from a pro-ISIS group who goes to Mindanao to buy guns. And when he's in Mindanao, he makes the acquaintance of a Malaysian who is now working with the guy who became Amir of the pro-ISIS groups, this Malaysian named Dr. Mahmud, who meets Dr. Mahmud. And then he goes back to Indonesia. In September 2016, in Nong Khai Detention Center in Thailand, there was an escape of 11 Uyghurs. And the Indonesian gets a call from Syria to go, they actually gets a contact by a telegram, to go and help one of those 11 Uyghurs who escaped from the prison. So Suryadi, his name, goes up to Nong Khai and spends a couple of days looking around, can't find the Uyghur, goes back to Indonesia, communicates with Syria. They say, you better find a local who can help you. Suryadi calls Dr. Mahmud in the Philippines, asks for a name of somebody who can help him in Thailand. They go back to Nong Khai, find the Uyghur, only to have Thai immigration officials on their tail at every moment, and 2 days later the Uyghur gets arrested again. But it's one incident that involves the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Syria, actually involves Turkey, but I didn't get in that part, and the Uyghurs, all in one incident. And there are other incidents like this that we can tell you about, but I just find these networks totally fascinating. That's what I do. Okay.
So, and we enjoy that you are doing what you are doing, so a big applause to... Question, you can continue the discussion outside. There is coffee and tea, and please, on your way out, leave a donation, because this alone allows Jackson to continue our activity. So thank you very much again, and see you at the next event. Bye.